I want to welcome you to this event, and I want to start out just with a few comments from my perspective to set the stage. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and we are one of the hosts of this event, and I'll talk about the others in a minute. But I want to start out by making a few very basic observations, if you wish, and one of them is that clearly we make better decisions if we get the facts straight. Data are really one way of getting at the facts, if you wish, but because there is so much data out there and we're bombarded really literally by it any minute, any day, it's often hard to know where to find the proper information, how to assess its usefulness, how to relate one data set to another, and then at the end, to actually make sense of all of this, to relate the data with each other and to make sense of it. And what this workshop and conference really is about is figuring out how to connect data to making sense and the stories that one can tell with this. And then obviously there are the challenges of knowing how the data have been collected and to properly clean it up for measurement errors and other problems that may be associated with it. And there are excellent techniques to do all of that. But really, at the end, it's also more than just technique. There is an art to it, to data management, to the use of data, and to the interpretation of data. And so I want to just really take only a couple of minutes to talk about the art alongside the techniques that go with this. So from my perspective, good data management and use is more than just executing a protocol. It is about knowing what can be done, what should be done, and what should not be done to and with data. Actually, the best use of data is the one that brings an understanding of the underlying mechanisms that generated the data to bear on the interpretation of the data. The people who are top in their field are the ones who can make the data sing, who can tell a story with the data. But it's not their story. It's the story of the processes and the systems that generated the data in the first place. So one way to express the social, the economic, the environmental fabric, if you wish, that generated the data is through geographic information systems, through visualization, through data analytics, data mining and machine learning. All of those play a major role in this. And then there are, of course, the feedback processes that ultimately led to the generation of the data in the first place. For example, when differences in local amenities generate heterogeneous demographic and socioeconomic outcomes across the urban landscape. This heterogeneity can lead to segregation, which then further entrenches the differences in who has access to which kinds of services. It generates differences in rental rates and mortgage lending practices. It leads to differences across the urban landscape in the socioeconomics with regard to educational outcomes, crime rates, health outcomes, and much, much more. So understanding how these relationships ultimately unfold really requires not just how one of these data sets, if you wish, are related to each other, but how one aspect of a system, how one process drives another. And understanding that dynamic is really key to ultimately also find the leverage points in the systems that we deal with to generate desirable outcomes. So having access to data and being able to mine it, to use it, and to communicate it effectively, to bring the stories to the people, if you wish, really brings with it great powers. Data can convince. And since with great power also comes great responsibility, it's important to abide by strict ethical rules and high standards when collecting, storing, using, sharing, interpreting data. So in short, what I really wanted to say is that the theme of this meeting today, of this conference, of the various workshops, democratizing data to drive community change, really this can only work if we have high standards on ethics for the use of data, if data are understood as the product of processes that unfold through time, and if data are placed in geographic context in which they are generated. So let me just close with some shameless advertisement, if you wish. As the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs here at Northeastern University, we are, of course, keenly aware not just of the challenges, but also of the opportunity that come with using data, and especially big data, that we are now mining and bringing to bear on a wide range of different decision making. So we have launched a master's program in urban informatics and a certificate program in data analytics and data sciences that together really are intended to generate the next series of decision makers who are really in tune with what can be done with data, how to get the facts straight, and how to ultimately make better decisions. So hosting this event here is really a great privilege for us, and I'm very thankful to that, and I want to welcome you to this. I want to thank you for being part of this. And specifically, I want to thank my colleagues at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, Mark Drayson, the Executive Director, who's here and who will speak next, and the Boston Indicators Project for helping make this Data Day possible. Thank you so much, and have a good day here at Northeastern.
Thank you, Matthias. We very much appreciate the welcome and the opportunity to be here back at the Curry Student Center at Northeastern for yet another Data Day. I was trying to remember this morning while I was waiting and waiting and waiting for the orange line how many Data Days I've actually been to, and I'm guessing this is around 8. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's around 8. At MAPC, we constantly go back and forth about whether or not Data Day is an annual event or a biannual event. I think the reality is it's sort of a little bit of each. We do it every year if we can. We can't do it every year. So I think in the dozen years I've been at MAPC, I've probably been here for about 12 years. I mean, I've been here for about 8 years at Data Days. It gets harder and harder to offer welcoming remarks. Because Holly usually says to me, well, you know what it's about. It's about democratizing data. And then I think to myself, well, okay, I've talked about democratizing data 8 times, and there are only a limited number of things you can say. So I had to think a little bit harder this time than I usually do. And what occurred to me was to make 2 broad points. One about democratizing data, which I'll get to in a moment, and the other about the particular topic for the day, which is prosperity. I have to tell you that I am always, and my staff knows this, I always get a little bit uncomfortable with the focus on prosperity. When we came to doing our prosperity indicators, I think people understood that I was a little questioning as to whether or not it should really be the next set of indicators we worked on. Should we do sustainability? Should we do work on our transportation system? Prosperity is important, but the study of prosperity always conveys with it the notion that the most important thing in people's lives is how rich they are, which I've never believed is really the most critical thing in life, and witness a 35-year career in the public sector. But I not badly compensated at the moment, really, but nonetheless, it always leaves me a tiny bit uncomfortable. And when I began to work with Jessie, who's going to speak in a few moments, on what our indicators were going to be about, really, she brought home to me the fact that the distribution of prosperity gives us an opportunity to sort of scratch the surface on a series of critical underlying issues in addition to the overall prosperity of the region, of its individual communities, whether they be geographic or demographic. It gives us the opportunity to see whether those resources are distributed in an equitable manner, whether that distribution has changed over time, how it's changed, whether or not those changes are the ones we expected and knew we would have to grapple with, or whether they are completely different and unanticipated. Certainly now is a critical moment to see how our society has changed after the Great Recession, not only because of the de facto impacts of that incident, which lasted for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, depending upon how you interpret it, but also as to whether or not there have been any critical underlying unmoving changes that don't seem to move back to prior patterns or seem to continue to express inequality despite the fact that the economy is now growing again and that the unemployment rate in Massachusetts is under 5%. I had a wonderful professor at Brandeis when I was an undergraduate, David Hackett Fisher, who taught me and everyone else in our class that it's important not only to look at the rate of change, but the underlying change in the rate of change. When do you actually turn a corner? When do you reach a bend? When do you come to an inflection point? What are some of the issues and moments in society which generate not simply change, because there's always change, but change in the rate of change for the better or for the worse? And I really feel that our analysis of prosperity here in the wake of the Great Recession can unveil a number of things about fundamental differences in our society, in home ownership, in income, in access to wealth, in the availability of good benefits, and a whole variety of other things which I think honestly give us pause and command us to try and link what we've learned from the data, what the indicators tell us, and our generation of public policy priorities and spending priorities and political direction as we go forward in our attempt to deliver a more just and prosperous society to our children. The second thing that I want to mention is a little bit about the overall work in the data field. We all know, and it will be on display yet again today, that we have more data available to us than ever before. And we are all grappling with how we can make that data available to people, make it available in a socially equitable way, narrow it down to get, as Matthias indicated, the real stories behind the data. But I think there's one more thing that we have to think about a lot, which is how you not only deliver data to people, even more than just delivering the story of the data to people, but how you generate within society a real understanding of how to use data, how to find facts, how to interpret them, how some people misinterpret them, so that, and I'll say again, our children may have the ability not only to access the data and use the data, but to understand what's going on, to understand what the data tells them, and to be able to evaluate in a critical way what other people tell them through the use of data. I worry sometimes that we are living in a society where people don't read as much unbiased sources with a journalistic ethic behind it. So many people spend time sort of reading the information of people who agree with them, or people who are arguing strenuously from the extremes of an issue, rather than trying to use data to figure out where the truth actually lies between the extremes. If we as a society are going to benefit from the democratization of data, we've got to spend as much time and as much resources on the issue of understanding. This is a challenge for us at MAPC, and I know for many of you, because we often get a lot of money and funding and direction to use and mine data, but it's much harder to get the resources to train people, to update the information, and to reevaluate it every 2 years, every 5 years, every 10 years. And so it's an obligation to us in the public sector, to the university community, to funders, both public and private, as we try and figure out this exciting new world of data and big data, how we can actually improve understanding in the use and interpretation of all that information. So I offer you these two broad points in the hope that you will keep them in mind to some minor extent during the very intriguing sessions that I know you're going to have here, and hopefully in your ongoing work in the data field when you leave here today. I want to welcome you. I want to again thank our hosts at Northeastern University. And I very much want to thank our partners in our data work, particularly but not exclusively, the City of Boston, Mayor Walsh and his whole team, and the Boston Foundation, Paul Grogan and his whole team. And we are very honored to have with us here today a star member of that team, Jessica Martin, the director of the Boston Indicators Project, who has been at the Boston Foundation since 2007. She brought with her, prior to that time, educational experience at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and also at the McCormick Institute, and has been a magnificent follower to, where is Jess? There she is, to Charlotte Kahn. I don't know if Charlotte is with us today, but of course was here at this podium for many years and was the originator and first director of the Indicators Project at TBF. Jessica has done a great job over the past several years to advance the indicators, to strengthen them, to make sure they are a critical and ongoing part of study and analysis in the city of Boston and in the Boston region. Jessica is going to come up and present and moderate the first panel, and we'll introduce the other speakers. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jessica Martin.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that great introduction. And to my partners at MAPC, we could not do the work that we do without you at all. And same to Northeastern and really all of you in the room. And so today, I'm here to kind of kick off this first plenary session on prosperity, where you will hear from MAPC's new Regional Prosperity Indicators report, as well as from the Boston Federal Reserve's Color of Wealth research, which is really profound. I hope that what I can show here is going to allow you some understanding of what we're going to be doing with the indicators going forward and to get some context for these next presentations. And so we all remember back in 2008 when the economy fell off a cliff and suddenly the topic of income inequality was thrust into the national headlines. But really, this came as no shock, I think, to those of us who've been looking at the data. And in fact, really as far back as our first report in 2000 and more explicitly in our 2009 Boston Indicators report, we really focused in on the issue of growing income inequality and this gash in the social fabric in Boston, finding that we were among the most, not just unequal places in the nation, but in the world. A couple of years later, in 2011, even after the recession technically ended, really an understanding that poverty and some of these underlying core needs were not changing led us to do a research study only on poverty, looking at indicators of poverty, where we found that despite great ups and downs in macroeconomic growth, poverty in Boston had not changed, the actual rate, since 1990. And when you think about it, this was time for a whole generation of Bostonians to be born, go to school, and enroll into college or even into the workforce. And so when we turn to today, 5 years plus out from the recession, you see the headlines and they look remarkably similar to those that we were seeing just a few short years ago. And the picture in Boston looks remarkably the same as well. We see that growth in real income is the rate of acceleration in terms of actual wages by quintile has really started to polarize. And we're seeing that since 2008, Boston's households are becoming more polarized, earning less than $10,000 annually or greater than $150,000. But at the same time, too, I think back to our first report released in 2000, and the questions that it posed that I think really sum up why the Indicators Project tracks data about Boston. It's not data for data's sake, but it's to help answer these questions. Can a city extend the benefits of economic success to all of its residents and neighborhoods? Can it retain a vibrant mix of ethnic and age diversity and income diversity, even as it attracts higher income residents? And can it create pathways to educational and economic success for all its young people? These were written in 2000. 15 years later, we're halfway through the lifespan of the Boston Indicators Project, looking towards the year 2030, and I think we can all agree that the answer is yes, but. Our population's growing faster than ever, we're becoming younger and more diverse, yet we remain highly segregated by race ethnicity. College completion rates for Boston's public high school graduates have been increasing, on track to hit a 70% graduation rate by 2017. And yet there are deep, persistent, there's something missing here actually, very deep, persistent racial, ethnic disparities in educational attainment outcomes. And we see that these disparities in the shape of inequality is very distinct in the city with, when it comes to income, where it's located, where education, these skills are located in the city of Boston, as well as where deep concentrated poverty lies. And so not just the Indicators Project, but I think as the whole nation, from think tanks to academic institutes to planning agencies, cities and states, try to pivot away from the challenge of inequality, you start to hear things like opportunity, mobility, prosperity, well-being. And I think there's really an incredible amount of research out there that we've been pulling from my team at the Boston Indicators Project and really trying to think about what we can cull from this to help us understand the indicators that we have been tracking for almost 20 years now. And so opportunity tends to be that topic or that word, a buzzword that we hear, and it's often framed as the goal that you're going to get to. It's the antidote to inequality. But I think that we're better off thinking about opportunity as the first step, a set of inputs in a ladder that moves us towards prosperity, economic or otherwise. But knowing that our economy is always, unfortunately, going to have bottom 1% and a top 1%, not just stopping at economic well-being, but individual and social emotional well-being, and how do we create an equal access and opportunities to high quality of life regardless of where you sit on the economic ladder. But ultimately, and I think we keep hearing more of this lately, is that the ultimate goal of economic and social upward mobility. And when we think about what these things mean, there are two ways to actually think about it. This has helped me frame out how I can interpret some of the data and some of the research that we've been reading. First is intragenerational. So where do I start as an individual at birth versus where I end as an adult? Excuse me, went fast there. The other, intergenerational mobility. This is typically what we think about when we refer to the American dream. How do I do as an adult relative to where my parents were in their generation at the same age? And even still, regardless of what kind of mobility, there's relative mobility, so the actual movement up or down, versus relative, where a person's position at any age compared to other generations relative to their peers. And so there are a number of different things that we are actually able to learn from the data, the research, the indicators that we're finding that have been around for a very long time, and new emerging data and frameworks for understanding these topics. Because as we see, there are many different tracks to actually getting to opportunity. And also it's important within this to think about equity and the gaps and who's on track, who's not on track. And so one thing to highlight, here's one example of some research done on various measures of intragenerational mobility, the life cycle. And what folks have consistently found is that advantage at birth, your circumstances, poverty, your family structure, parents' educational attainment, mother's well-being and health, has actual impacts on outcomes throughout the life. So when you actually, trying to move through this quickly, excuse me, look at those who are born in less advantaged circumstances, you see that by age 5, 11, 19, 29, and eventually at adulthood at 40, those who have reached the middle class, or about 300% of federal poverty level, there's a 20 or so percentage point gap between those born with less advantage and those born with more advantage. Less advantage is the orange-ish bar. But what their research is also showing is that your status at birth is not fixed, and that through cumulative high-impact, high-quality interventions, such as early education, access to high-quality schools, and a host, many more intangible interventions, that those gaps can actually be narrowed. Another key way that data is helping to inform how we can think about mobility, I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the work that Raj Chetty at Harvard has been doing through the Equality of Opportunity Project really looks at the elements of place and finds that, not surprisingly, there are pretty stark variations in terms of opportunities and access and likelihood of upward mobility across the United States. And here, Boston actually ranked pretty well. We were among the top 10 in terms of the chances that a child born at the lowest income level of the income spectrum would eventually achieve the highest level of the income spectrum as an adult. But when you break that down, you actually see that a child born at the bottom 10%, only about 10% will eventually reach that top income decile. Oh, excuse me. Ooh, excuse me. On average, they'll reach about the 40th percentile, but even still, about a third will remain at the bottom. But interestingly, what these studies have started to show are some of the key elements, the characteristics of the places that have higher or lower upward mobility. And these are among some of the indicators that we've been tracking all along that are in some of these community data systems that we all use every day, like racial segregation, isolated poverty, commute times. Transit is just as important as proximity to high quality schools in terms of the likelihood of places with high mobility. Teen labor force participation rates. Social capital measures, moving beyond just the pure economic measures, but those measures of well-being. And also family formation, but less so about individuals and more about the concentration. And by place. And more recently, some of this work found that place, not only are these causal relationships, or correlated relationships are causal, and that the more time a child actually spends in places with higher or lower characteristics of mobility has real impacts on their income. And so when we kind of take a step back and consume a lot of this data and more that you will hear, it's hard to kind of interpret it and figure out how to make it useful in our everyday work, especially when you consider that a baby born in 2015 in Boston will be 5 in 2020. Will be in 7th grade, maybe transitioning to high school in 2027, graduating from high school in 2033, beyond the goal year of the Boston Indicators Project. Maybe complete college, start a career path, have a child of their own, and eventually reach age 40 and the American dream in the year 2055. So I think we can all agree that we don't want to wait that long to know whether we've succeeded in making sure that the child has those career and economic and educational pathways. And so what we've started to do is distill a lot of this data and research that many of you in the room have actually helped to inform, and look through our 300 plus indicators that exist in the Boston Indicators Project framework, and try to distill them a bit using, guided by some of the work that we've been studying. And we focused on 6 domains. And this is really going to be a framework for our work moving forward. And we invite you all really to join in with this. As we think about what those key indicators are for children in Boston and in the region, from birth to workforce and career, adulthood, we really want to actually start to distill not just the high-level indicators, which we can very easily see, excuse me. Oh, pardon me, I think. But really what's under the hood of all of these indicators, whether it's early childhood enrollment in high-quality preschool, credentialing and degree obtainment, finding access to jobs and employment, but also understanding what's the landscape of job and employment opportunities in your neighborhood, in your community that's accessible by commutes. Moving beyond not just median household income, but really getting to understand and under the hood of wealth and earnings and where these disparities lie. And then ultimately taking a look at, as we have done for the past 15 years, a nested approach to understanding these indicators, looking at neighborhoods citywide, connecting it to the regional prosperity, and then ultimately comparing ourselves back again to how we stack up nationally. And so This framework of opportunity and the measure of opportunity is going to be informing in much of our work going forward. We'll be doing some actual reports on each one of these topics and hosting forums, convenings, events to understand what's being done here and how to connect some of the dots through indicators. So I welcome you all and would like to turn it over now to Jesse Partridge to let us, research analyst from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, who is going to be presenting MAPC's regional prosperity indicators, and I think really forming how we're doing in a much deeper way. So, thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jessica. I'm really excited to be here today to present to you some of the findings from our regional indicators report in Metro Boston. So, as Mark so eloquently put it this morning, when we are thinking about measuring prosperity in Metro Boston, we of course are going to look at the classic economic indicators of labor force, jobs, and wages. But we also know that the prosperity of our region is dependent on the prosperity of the individuals and families that make up our region. And there's more and more evidence that regions that are integrated and equitable across race, income, and space are better able to sustain long-term economic growth and resiliency. So we're also sure in our prosperity indicators to measure, to try and get at some of those measurements of individual and family well-being. So just a little bit of background on our prosperity indicator, on our regional indicators project. Our regional indicators are a set of measures to track the progress of the goals and objectives of Metro Future, which many of you in the room are probably familiar with, is the long-range plan for Metro Boston to the year 2030 for a more sustainable and equitable region. The goals and objectives span 6 topic areas, including prosperity, transportation, land use, environment and energy, and others. And by tracking the indicators, we're able to measure how the region is doing in achieving those goals. It also allows us to highlight areas where we need interventions to make changes in the direction that the indicators are going. So today I'm talking about prosperity. The first indicators report we put out was actually state of equity, which was a check-in on how we're doing in terms of equity across all 6 topic areas. And just to keep it on your radar, we will be releasing sustainable transportation indicators in the fall. So as we were looking at prosperity indicators, similar to Jessica's presentation, we kind of had this, we're doing well, but we saw overall in aggregate terms, the region is faring pretty well economically. Jobs and wages are up over historic peaks. Our labor force is slowly but steadily growing. Yet there are still these measures where the region is really not doing well. And a lot of those have to do with divergence in how individual sectors are performing and also the economic and well-being outcomes of our individuals and families across different racial groups and across different community types. So as our region continues to become more diverse, it's really important that we make interventions to reverse those trends. So just to orient us spatially to what I mean by Metro Boston, this is generally the geography I'm talking about. Depending on the data source, the boundaries, specific boundaries might shift a little bit, but this is our 164 Metro Future, Metro Boston communities. And if I zoom in here, the colors here show different community types in the region that MAPC uses to describe our municipalities. So the dark blue here in the middle, these are inner core communities. These are denser cities in and around Boston. The light blue cities are our regional urban centers. Those are denser cities around the region that act as economic hubs regionally. And then we have in green our maturing suburbs, and in yellow our developing suburbs. And I'll be talking about community types in a few of these indicators. So first, as I mentioned, jobs in the region are up finally in 2013 from previous historic peaks. This shows overall jobs in the region by community type. So we can see at 2.4 million jobs, we're just inched over the 2.4 million jobs back in 2001. You can see the region lost quite a lot of jobs during the 2001 recession, and we actually never made up all of those jobs by the time the Great Recession hit in 2008. Since 2008, we've had pretty steady growth. Since 2009, excuse me, we've had pretty steady growth. And a lot of that growth has been in the inner core communities. We've also seen a lot of growth in our developing suburbs, although they make up a much smaller share of total jobs. But in fact, if we look at the numbers for our maturing suburbs and regional urban centers, these communities, while they've done well since the recession, still have not quite made it back to pre-recession levels. I mean, pre-2001 levels. In terms of our labor force, as I mentioned, we're slowly but steadily growing. Between 2000 and 2010, we had about 3% growth, which is just slightly slower than population growth. This chart here shows the labor force in purple, which is made up of employed workers in blue and unemployed workers in red. Unemployed are on the second y-axis here. The gray areas indicate recession years. So you can see since 2004, we've had fairly steady growth in our labor force. We've also had generally downward trends in unemployment and generally upward trends in employed workers. Our unemployment rate as of 2014 was 5.3, which was back down to long-term 25-year average rates, and it's lower since then. However, the official unemployment rate doesn't actually necessarily tell the full experience of Metro Boston workers. So there are a lot of workers who are discouraged in terms of trying to find a job, and if they have not looked actively for a job within the last 4 weeks when they are surveyed, they're actually not counted as part of the labor force. Those are considered discouraged workers and are not part of the official unemployment rate. There are also workers who are in part-time jobs who have either had their hours cut or can't find full-time work but need more hours to make a sustainable living. These workers are considered employed in the labor force figures, but it would be a little bit more accurate to say they're underemployed. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes a useful metric, which they call the underutilization rate. I've called it underemployment here. And that's this rate here in dark red at the top compared to the official unemployment rate in lighter red. So it makes sense that the underemployment rate would be higher than the unemployment rate because it captures those discouraged and part-time workers. But what's disturbing about the trends here is that pre-recession in 2007, the gap between unemployed and underemployed workers was about 3 percentage points. Then that shot up and more than doubled during the recession to just over 6 percentage points. And while both indicators have been trending downward, we have not done a great job at getting those discouraged and underemployed workers back to work, and the gap remains, back to gainful employment, and the gap remains at about 6 percentage points. So thinking about what types of jobs our workers have in the region, this chart shows the change in jobs by industry sector over 2001 numbers. So starting here in 2001 at 0, showing cumulative percentage change in number of jobs. And we can see here by 2013, our best performing sectors are education and health services, leisure and hospitality, and just inching into positive growth, professional and business services. So the region has really primarily been dependent on these 3 sectors for long-term growth. Professional and business services has had some ups and downs with both recessions, but has kind of performed well post-recession in both time periods. On the other hand, our manufacturing jobs have had steady and significant downward trend loss of jobs, and have actually lost close to 37% of their jobs over 2001 numbers. Excuse me. So to better understand what these trends mean in terms of prosperity and in terms of our workers, we need a little bit more information. So this chart has a lot of information in it, so bear with me as I kind of try to explain. Each bubble here represents an industry sector. And on the x-axis here, we have percent change in jobs. So those bubbles on the right side of zero are industry sectors that have had positive job growth. And the bubbles on the left here are those that have had negative job growth. On the y-axis, we have percent change in wages. So again, sectors above zero have had positive wage growth, and sectors below zero have had declining wages in inflation-adjusted 2013 dollars since 2001. The size or area of the bubble is proportional to the number of jobs, the share of jobs that that sector has in 2013 in the region, and the colors change from dark red to dark blue with low to high average wages. So we can see here that highest growth sector, education and health services. This is also the region's largest sector with more than 600,000 jobs. It's had 15% wage growth as well, so this is great news. And in terms of average wages, it falls about in the middle of the average wage spectrum. So this is a good news for the region. On the other hand, leisure and hospitality, which was our second fastest growing industry at 23% growth, has actually seen declining wages at 3% decline, and already is the lowest average wage sector in the region, with average wages at, I think, around 27,000, which is really less than it takes to live in the region. Up here, business and professional services. This is really what people think of when they think of the knowledge economy in Metro Boston. These are jobs that require a fairly high level of education. It can be engineers, researchers, computer systems analysts, and other professions that require a fair amount of education. They're also really well-paying average jobs, and they've had the most wage growth over 2001 at 18% wage increase. The last one I'm going to talk about here is currently our third largest industry sector, which used to be, in 2001 was the second largest, but it has had not only declining declining jobs since 2001 that dropped it down to third position, but also declining wages at 8% decline. And these, again, falling in the middle income, middle wage range. A lot of the jobs lost in this industry have been some of the more middle wage jobs that require less education. So this is not great in terms of the region's middle wage earners. So these kind of trends combined can start to help us understand some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of growing income disparity. Here, this is looking at average household income by quintiles, and quintiles is simply if we kind of ordered all the households in Metro Boston from low to high and split them into 5 equal groups. Each line here represents the average household income for those income groups. What's really kind of disturbing here is the huge gap between the highest income quintile and really all the others. So at $260,000 for average household income. It's more than 18 times higher than the average income for the lowest quintile, which at about $14,300 is pretty much in poverty. And that's 20% of our households. Not only that, but over time, the wages in the highest quintile have increased in inflation-adjusted dollars by about 10%, whereas for that lowest quintile, they've actually decreased by about 3%. Here's just another way to look at that same information, just in terms of the year 2013. This is our highest quintile at 260, lowest quintile at 14,300. And these are just, I apologize if you can't really read this in the back, but these are some reference dollars for living wages in the region. And these come from Clinton Women Union's Economic Independence Index. So down here for a single worker with no children, the living wage is about $30,000 in order to live independently without assistance. For a one-worker household with one child, that jumps up to about $50,000 a year. And for a two-worker household with two children, it's closer to $80,000 a year. So you can see really 2/5 of the region really are not making enough to live independently in the region. So one of the most important ways to increase income outcomes over your lifetime and to advance career paths is through getting a college degree. And Metro Boston is known for its knowledge economy. It's known for having a highly educated workforce. And in fact, we fairly consistently rank high compared to other metro areas. Of the top 25 metro areas, we're in third over the last several years in terms of share of population with a college degree or greater. And as this chart shows here in light blue, this is the year 2000, dark blue is 2007 to 11. We have increased college degree attainment by about 5 percentage points across the board in the region. This shows the region overall, and then in terms of our community types. So this is inner core communities here, regional urban centers, and our suburban communities. What this also shows, however, is that the gap between educational attainment in regional urban centers compared to the region overall is quite large. So fewer adults in our regional urban centers have college degrees. And another way to think about gaps in terms of race and ethnicity in the region, we see stark disparities in terms of educational attainment outcomes. So while it is true that since 2000, educational attainment, college degree attainment has increased across all races and ethnicities in the region, there are still these persistent gaps in attainment rates for adults of color compared to white adults, which you can see here. This is actually showing Metro Boston in blue compared to the United States average in red. And while our educational attainment rates across the board are higher than the average in the country overall, our gaps in educational attainment by race and ethnicity are larger. And they have not made any significant improvements since the year 2000. So Anna Patricia is going to talk a lot more in detail about wealth and asset attainment in terms of race and ethnicity. But one of the most important ways for a family to build wealth and pass that wealth down through generations is through home ownership. And this chart here shows, for the region, home ownership rates in Metro Boston and in the United States across race and ethnic groups. So generally, we can see that Metro Boston here in blue has lower rates of home ownership which kind of makes sense. It's really expensive to buy a house here. We have a lot of students. But what this chart also shows is that, again, compared to the United States overall, the gaps in homeownership rates by race and ethnicity are larger. So you can see here for white households, the 68% homeownership rate is larger than the Asian rate. It's about double the rate for black households, and it's more than double the rate for Latino households. So I guess I will, before I pass the mic to Ana, just a quick recap and reflection on the trends that we're seeing in these prosperity indicators. Job growth in the region is strong and unemployment is down, but long-term growth is principally reliant on just 3 sectors, and we still have a lot of workers who remain underemployed. Average wages are up overall, but in some fast-growing sectors, wages are actually declining, and this is contributing to growing income inequality in the region. And finally, while our labor force is growing and becoming more diverse, persistent gaps in economic outcomes remain. So to ensure equitable prosperity in a diversifying region, closing these gaps is critical. So it is my honor, and I'm excited to introduce Ana Patricia Munoz from the Boston Fed, and she is the Director of Community Development Research in the Regional Community Outreach Department at the Fed, and her work is primarily focused on issues related to wealth inequality, asset building, equal access to credit, and immigration. And she's also studied the role of Latino entrepreneurship in economic prosperity and in smaller regional communities.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Jesse, and thank you for the invitation. You've seen already a lot of data, so I hope I can keep you awake. And I have a few reports here for later if you want to look through that. The report's also available online. So I work in the community development function of the Central Bank of the United States, and very few people know that we exist. Even people who work in the building and at the Boston Fed know that there's such a thing as community development in the central bank. And I won't go through the history of the department because that's not the purpose of today's convening, but our mission is to improve the lives of lower and moderate income communities and families. And we do that through research, through convening different parties, and through disseminating approaches that work. And we do a lot of outreach and working with community-based organizations on the ground. And I direct the applied research group in this department. So I'm going to add 2 layers of complication into all the story that we've been hearing about today. So one is this layer of looking at race, ethnicity, and country of origin, which already Jesse referred to at the end of her presentation. And the other one is to go beyond talking about income and income inequality and talking about wealth. So this complicates a lot, not only the data collection, but the data interpretation, and then thinking about solution, it gets very, very complicated. So as Matthias was talking, he talked about talking about geographic context and finding the leverage point. And so with that in mind, this data has been collected in the Boston metro area. So the data that I'm going to show is representative of the Boston metro area. We cannot make extrapolations to this for these groups for others areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit very briefly about the importance of wealth and how it's currently measured in the United States. And then I'm going to walk you through some of the findings of this report that is entitled The Color of Wealth in Boston. And it's based on a survey that we conducted in partnership with the Ford Foundation and Duke University. So wealth allows families to make investments for the future. And families can have income, but if they don't have wealth, they cannot provide for future generations. Wealth allows to invest in education, in businesses, and allows to have a safety net for retirement. Some researchers for already 20 years have already said that a true poverty reduction policy needs to reduce wealth gap and racial wealth gap in particular. So work of Sheridan and Tom Shapiro at Brandeis University, we're already looking in the trends of racial wealth inequality in the United States. Now, this is very complicated to gather and to interpret, so maybe that's why we don't hear much about wealth inequality, whereas we have been hearing a lot about income inequality. So, and pardon to those who are familiar with this term and work daily with this idea of balance sheet, but just to very quickly use the bathtub analogy that it seems a lot of people like, and it's interesting because I heard about how to measure wealth in my first class in economics a long time ago, and this idea of the bathtub was brought to me when you try to differentiate between stock and flows. So I thought I'll just bring it back to my presentation and see that it's worked so far. So income is a flow that you get on a regular basis, and then you have your expenses that you have to use your money for, and then what you have left there, that's your wealth, that's a stock. So which means that when you measure income inequality, that's just part of the story, right? Because you can have income, but if you don't have water left in that bathtub, then if you are facing an emergency like an unemployment or medical emergency, you're going to be in a very unstable situation. So as in any company, families also have their own balance sheets. They have the asset side and they have the debt side. And the way we calculate that, the wealth in this study is just subtracting liabilities from the assets. And I'm making this clarification because sometimes when we talk about wealth, people link it to assets. And again, that's only part of the balance sheet. So when I'm going to talk about wealth, and the whole purpose of this study is really looking at the net value. You could have a home, you could even have home equity in your home, but if you have a lot of debts, then you really, again, don't have much to use in case of emergencies. The types of assets we're looking in this study are things that range from money in a checking and savings account, retirement accounts, vehicles, homes, and then on the liability side, we'll look at mortgages, vehicle debt, student loans, installment loans, and all kinds of things that you can imagine. And then you subtract them and you get to the calculation. So this type of data is collected in the United States at the national, providing estimates at the national level. And there are three main surveys that do that. And I'm not going to go through each one of the surveys. And the estimates vary significantly depending on the survey you use. So the two shortcomings of these surveys are, one, that most estimates are provided nationally. And that's why, again, when you see reports in the newspapers, most data is provided nationally. There's not really data at the local level, and that's one of the purpose of this study, that were collected for the first time data in the Boston metropolitan area. And the other shortcoming of this survey is that at most you can make, can you hear me? Like that? Yeah. At most you can make comparisons between whites and blacks. Sometimes you can compare whites, Hispanics, and blacks. Although, for example, the survey of consumer finance says when you go to the official summary data, they only compare whites with non-whites. And the point we want to make is that within these groups are not homogenic, right? There's a lot of differences depending on the country of origin and the history that all these groups that have had in the United States. So we wanted to get at those nuances with this data. So the Boston Fed, we partnered with the Ford Foundation and Duke University to bring this survey that's called the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color, to the Boston MSA. So this was a survey that was going to be conducted in 4 metropolitan areas across the country, and we thought, well, this is very important for our region. This is a very diverse and very uniquely diverse region, and we would like to learn about this data to then help us make decisions about the future of our region. So this data set, this instrument, which is a 140-page instrument, replicates some of the survey questions that the other the other surveys asked, so we can compare one to the other. But it also includes questions that are not asked in the other surveys. Questions about use of paid-on lending, questions about health, about how people feel about the recession, about whether they have felt discriminated against at some point in their lives. A lot of questions about immigration and background of their families, country of origin, year of immigration, type of education. So a lot of things that can help us understand this population better. So again, getting to Matthias' point about geographic context, the drawback of our survey is because the sample size is very small, the external validity is a problem, and making inferences with such a small sample size is complicated. And again, this was meant to be representative of this group living in the Boston MSA. So why is it important to collect data for non-white groups in the Boston MSA? Well, population in the region, in New England and in Boston, is driven entirely by non-white population. White population declined by 3% in the past 12 years. And here what I'm trying to disaggregate a little bit about the growth of different groups in the Boston MSA. So if you see the Dominican group, for example, is the one that has the highest percentage growth in the past 12 years, in about 121% from 2000 to 2012. Of course, you have to keep in mind what's the base. This is not absolute numbers. This is the percentage growth, but the growth keeps happening, and overall in the Boston MSA, Hispanic population is close to 10%. In the Boston city, is close to 20%. So if you put this even closer geographic region, closer to Boston, this becomes even more important. So I'm going to walk you through. Is there a way you can see it on the screen here? Well, that's fine. I can walk you through like that. So we're going to look at one side of the balance sheet. This is our assets. And this is asking whether the household has these different types of assets. Thank you. So, so the percentage of households that has checking accounts, savings accounts, stocks, and private retirement accounts. And the groups that I'm highlighting here are some of the ones we targeted. So we differentiate between U.S. blacks and Caribbean blacks. And you can actually see some statistical significant difference between groups, which I'm not going to go through today, but I think it's important to keep in mind. So we have U.S. blacks, Caribbean blacks, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, other Hispanics, and we also collected data on Cape Verdeans that I'm not going to show you today because the sample size is small and that can lead to some misinterpretation of facts. But we do have the data and have it on the report, data on Cape Verdeans. You will see throughout the presentation today and in the report, we're not going to present data on Asians for two reasons. We have data for about, I think, 15 Asians that we collected, but we are not able to disaggregate by country of origin. And in the Asian groups, and I think of all groups, the difference is very striking. So when you look at the stories nationally, Asians are surpassing whites in terms of income, and now they're surpassing in terms of wealth. But if you look at the differences, for example, Japanese between Cambodian or Vietnamese, the differences are so big that I'm not going to even talk about aggregate Asians because that's like against the whole purpose of this study. Not to say that it's not valuable to look at the data. I think the point is let's try to get more detailed data and broken down by different groups. So with those caveats in mind, what this shows you is striking differences in terms of owning accounts, and all of those differences compared to whites are statistically significant despite having a small sample. So just to give you quick examples, more than 90% of whites have checkings accounts. About half of Puerto Ricans have checkings accounts. 82% of Caribbean blacks and 74% of U.S. blacks have savings account. If you look at checkings account, if you get savings account, for all the groups, the percentages are lower. But you can see there that about 40% of the Hispanic groups we targeted have a checking account. Now, if you look at stock, about 40% of whites have some kind of stocks. Less than 10% of all the other groups that we studied have some kind of stocks. And if you look at retirement accounts, less than 8% of Dominicans have private retirement accounts, whereas more than half of white households that we studied have private retirement accounts. So I'm not going to make a lot of interpretations today, and also anything I said does not represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston or the Federal Reserve System. system. But even speaking on my own words, it's hard to talk about drivers or interpret this data. This is a snapshot, but you can make some conclusions or your own. Like if most people don't have private retirement account, then I think it's a fair conclusion to say that, well, Social Security, if they have access to, will be the mainly or the only resource when these folks retire. Now, if you look at the other side of the balance sheet, we are asking them whether they have these different types of debt. If you look at credit cards, it's not necessarily asking whether you have a credit card, but whether do you have debt on your credit card. And again, so here, actually, you don't see many differences that are statistically significant. So I think the story is, on the asset side, huge differences, all statistically significant. On the debt side, all groups seem to be as likely to have types of debt, again, keeping in mind small sample size. The exceptions, they are the ones that are in red circles. So more likely to have student loans are Caribbean blacks and other Hispanics, much more likely to have medical debts, Dominicans and other Hispanics, all compared to white. So if we look at medical debt, for example, 11% of white households have medical debt, twice as much that percentage of Dominicans have medical debt. Which is, I think, worrisome, given that at Boston MSA, Massachusetts is a great place to live in terms of medical access, but we see those differences there. Now, for student loans, again, this is actually the positive picture in that we are considering all households. So if we were to restrict this to households that are actually have gone to college or had to pay for education, then the differences will be much, much bigger. But this is looking overall at the household level. Now, if you look at the tangible assets, Jesse already showed you the picture for home ownership in the region. Usually, Massachusetts and Boston have lower home ownership rates, but really, as you saw in her slide, when you break it down, the white home ownership rate wasn't that different from the others across the nation. So the difference is driven by the other groups. And this is the one variable that you can use it from microdata from the census, not only by different bigger group race and ethnic groups, but even by country of origin. So you can get, using microdata from the census, what are the values for home ownership rate for Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Cape Verdeans, and so on. And the differences here are actually very similar to what you would find in the census. Our estimates for whites are a little bit higher than what Jesse showed and what you can find in the census. But the story is the same. Huge, huge differences in the likelihood of having a house. Now, if you go to the vehicle side, so here I don't have circles to show statistical significance because you will find 3 stars all across, by 90% significant all across the assets and also the house. With vehicles, the ones that were statistically significant was vehicle ownership for U.S. blacks and for Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. Caribbean blacks have a much higher likelihood of owning a vehicle, and that's not significantly different from whites. Now, if you look at the debts that may allow you to acquire these assets, this is again another kind of important story in that when we look at aggregate data and when we say, well, let's look at the percentage of families that have mortgages, well, that doesn't look that different, and it's mainly because non-white families don't have a home, so didn't need a mortgage to buy that home. So you can see, for example, on that side, in terms of mortgages, I showed you before, Caribbean blacks seem more likely to own a house, but 91% of them has a mortgage in it compared to about 60% of white homeowners that have a mortgage. So 40% have paid off their mortgage already. In terms of vehicle, there are not many statistical significance in terms of those who have vehicles, who has a debt on that. It seems that it's pretty similar across groups. Now, we already saw the huge differences in education attainment, and absolutely the premium on earnings for education keeps increasing over time. That's very important. The gaps are huge. It's crucial that we do that. But even when we control by education, we see immense gaps by race and ethnicity. And here I'm doing what I'm not supposed to do, which is regrouping these different segregated groups, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to compare taking into account education and age. So what you can see here, for example, if you look at those who have bachelor's degree or higher, and you have in blue the percentage of banked households, and in red the home ownership rate. So just concentrating on the red one, home ownership rate, what you can see is that across the levels you would see higher rates because it's a more educated population. But still huge differences. So less than 50% of whites and Hispanics own a home, even among those who have bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 80% of whites. So I think that's worrisome. And again, saying that education may not be the only solution. Like, just let's keep in mind that having assets to rely on is also important and correlated to education, and we don't know which one is driving what. And same thing we control for age, because that's another, of course, reasonable question that I get. Maybe the differences we saw in terms of retirement accounts and the types of accounts, formal accounts, banking accounts people have, is just because it's normal in your life cycle that you get these assets or not. Well, for people who are between 51 and 65 years old, again, huge gaps. So just looking at the red bar there, 82% of whites have a house compared to a third of Hispanics and 45% of blacks. So this report is descriptive. We've been running now more kind of regressions and controlling for not only education, but also marital status and even employment. And we do find that all the differences in kind of more controlled methodology, the differences persist for all groups compared to whites. Now, part of this exercise was to put a dollar value to this so we can make the actual calculation of the net value. And so what this shows you is the median liquid assets in dollars for these different groups in the Boston MSA. So the median, 50% has more than this, 50% has less than that. We're not presenting averages, because especially in this type of calculations, one household can pull up the average, and so it's very it's a very skewed distribution. So the median, so the typical white household in the Boston MSA has about $25,000 compared to $700 for blacks, $3,500 for U.S. Caribbeans, less than $200 for Cape Verdeans, $20 Puerto Ricans, $150 for Dominicans. So you can read the numbers. And just as I'm presenting these numbers, it's so interesting that even like when I presented to senior management, they were asking me, is there a mistake? Like, it seems unlikely that on the net Puerto Ricans have $20, how that can be. When you present this data to community-based organizations, they don't even ask the question. That's the life. Like, that's what we see every day. So it's interesting how we interpret data and how we live the data in our own lives. Now, again, these are all estimates and based on self-reporting, and there's missing data, but attempting to get not only to the liquid assets, which I showed you before, but now including equity and vehicles and more the tangible assets and subtracting debts, we get to the median net worth, median wealth in Boston MSA. So whites, close to $250,000, and then you can read the other numbers. So the differences are so big that I'm not even showing you 10 times larger, 20 times larger, because it's just, I think the numbers speak for themselves. And again, if you were to compare this with, with surveys at the national level, median net worth for whites in the Boston MSA, much higher. And again, people that have run this data well, it's not surprising, because home equity, it's like prices are much higher in here, so keeping that into account. So again, trying to use the same groupings of education and then age. In this time, I can only show you data for blacks. Everybody does better with higher education, and when you get older as well. So if you look at those who have bachelor's degree or higher, the white median gets close to $300,000, and the black median is $12,000. So again, better, but the gaps are still there. So just one slide on another paper that we just released using the same data. And what this paper does is it looks at financial transfers between family members. And and shows you the differences between the household, what the households give to families and what they receive for help to buy a house or to pay for education or as a inheritance. So what you see there is across the board, non-white groups are more likely to kind of give to their kinship and less likely to receive, and you can see the differences there. So one of the points here, I'm not going to go through the results of the paper, is that that's something that's hard to think about, that more and more researchers are thinking about this idea of kinship and intergenerational transfers. So the wealth disparity it's so complicated, in part because it's about what's been happening over centuries and the policies that have affected the disparities that we keep seeing in an accumulative way today. So that's kind of just to reinforce that story. So I think that the takeaways that I would like to leave you with is, first, this is really hard data to get, but that's why we thought we would join this. For the whole project, for the 5 metropolitan areas where this was collected, there were 70,000 numbers that were dialed, and we got 2,700 completed surveys. So productivity rate extremely low, in part because we were screening out households that did not meet our criteria for the different race and ethnic groups. So this is very hard to collect, but at the same token, I think it's very important to gather this data and follow over time. And I'm a huge fan of the Boston Indicators Project and the MAPC's data. I've followed them for so long, and I'm thrilled to be here at this podium today. So and I've encouraged you to keep thinking about these very complicated matters and collect more data. So that's one takeaway. It's hard to do, but it's important. Another one is, let's think beyond income and try to see what are the things that influence in this wealth accumulation. A lot of policies at the federal level try to at least give kind of that's safety money for families, but not much to think about asset building and wealth accumulation. There's some policies for folks who have already the means and can take advantage of those policies, but not so much for those who haven't much. And finally, I think it's very important to incorporate the views of the different groups that know on the ground what are the challenges and what could be the opportunities that these groups are bringing them in terms of policy is very important. And just going to leave you with a sense of urgency. We're talking before with Matthias. We've come used to see these differences, and I think it's time to act and I'm hopeful that we'll see some change soon. Thank you so much.
I guess my very important role is to call on people to ask questions. So anyone could do this, really. But we do have an opportunity to ask questions. We have an opportunity to hear comments if they're short. And I'm going to try and create a rule where in most cases one person will reply, only because I find that if all three reply, we have much fewer questions that we can actually take. So when you stand up, please let us know your name and your affiliation, okay? Who would like to be first?
Mark, actually, I might take a presenter's prerogative and just
make
a quick statement. What I noticed in both of your presentations that I think is something we've tried to address through the Indicators Project over time, but you're really doing well, is getting at, it's not just about the trends and high-level indicators and data, but really the importance of understanding the differences between employment and underemployment, how they differ and what the implications are, and understanding the difference between assets and wealth or income and earnings, and how those differences play out across the space and in the data. It's really exciting to see that the research that you're doing and the indicators you're putting out there and making accessible is getting us to a deeper understanding of what's really happening. And I think your last point makes a great promotion for one of our afternoon sessions on folks who are bringing community members into the research process and data collection process as a strategy there. So.
Absolutely, well put. Miss.
Hi, my name is Karen Sargent, and I work for the Winchester Multicultural Network. And my question is specifically for Jessica, I think. So in one of your slides, you mentioned the American dream as being kind of the end point. But how are you taking into consideration in your data the different definitions of the American dream? Because it's, not the same for all people.
For sure. And actually, I think that what we're finding, and what you've seen in each one of these presentations, is that there were probably many different actual data definitions for that. I know some of the work that the Social Genome Project uses looks at 300% federal poverty level. Well, even in Boston, that's not quite up to the Economic Independence Index wages that Jessie pointed out in her, that Crittenden Women's Union looks at. And also, just because it's income doesn't necessarily mean it's liquid or that it's enough to promote kind of well-being and quality of life. And I think that that's what I kind of learned myself in looking at some of these various frameworks with these buzzwords of inequality, opportunity, mobility, American dream, is that they're all related, but they do mean different things. And I think it's important not to have the measures of success all be purely economic or fiscal, that there are really fantastic frameworks for measuring quality of life, well-being, that should exist regardless of, and hopefully we can infuse that into what we do.
Thank you. Yes, right over there. Nope, that's you. Right there.
I
No?
had the mic already.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that.
I sort of silently raised my
I told you I was completely unneeded here.
Yeah.
So.
Marie Frances Rivera at Mass Budget, and I'd love for all of you to answer this question, but if only one of you can, that'd be fine. If you had one policy that you could champion and push forward to change some of these disparities that we're seeing, which one would it be?
If people can be, reasonably brief, then why don't you all do it?
I can say from the perspective of MAPC, I think it's safe to say affordable housing is one of the biggest ones. So being able to kind of decrease the gap in homeownership really depends on having more affordable housing stock. It also, not everyone is going to buy a house, and more than half of the region's households are renter, or at least more than half in Boston are renter households. So having access to affordable living is really important in terms of getting by economically.
I can, okay.
Yes, of course.
So again, not from the Fed's perspective, but just keeping in mind this idea of what the assets you start with, or that net worth you start with, is very important for your future life in many ways. One of the things we've been working on is children's savings account, not directly, but working with states in New England and in a coalition about children's savings account, and this idea of each child, and I would even do more than targeting those who have less, has something to start with. So you start with the seed money in your account, and that can help you in the future. So I think that's an interesting policy that's happening at a local level, and who knows if at some point nationally. Others call it children trust funds, and I kind of go beyond the $500, but the principal investigators of this project, they're advocating for like $20,000 trust funds for each child in the United States. So that's not my own idea, but I think it's some innovation in the field.
Jess?
Yeah, I don't know about any one particular policy, but following on the asset generation focus, I think there are some really interesting models out there of nationally and locally, and like the Family Independence Initiative and work that LISC Boston is doing around actually harnessing the social capital and capacities of communities to share information, and with the focus on building assets and wealth, and really kind of taking some of the middle layers of service delivery and provision out of it, and tapping into maybe places where traditional systems of banking or lending might not work so well for some people.
Thank you all, and yes, right over there.
Hi, my name is Mara Averick. I'm with the Economic Development Assistance Consortium. I don't know that I represent their views, but
Maybe.
I guess, Jesse, it kind of dovetails.
Could you speak a little closer to the mic? Thank you.
Sorry. I think it dovetails on what you were saying a little. Is there any evaluation of the opportunity cost of home ownership in terms of affordable housing would be great, but I know that home ownership has traditionally been such a pervasive metric of, assets and wealth, but as somebody who's young and living in Boston, I noticed that there might be other ways of spending those same resources. Do you guys examine that at all, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure specifically. I don't know if Jessica.
Well, I think that, oh God.
I'll
and
take
this is
it
where
if you want.
I actually think that this is where new data systems and more readily available data are getting better, like providing better information about what things do cost. And I think there's a lot of work going on in terms of the cost of producing housing and the cost to rent versus cost to own. Oh God, I might defer to the planners and policymakers.
I have some thoughts about this, I suppose, so I'll jump in. I think it's, just for people to understand, I have spent most of my life as a housing planner, so it's kind of the field that's very special to me. I have been intrigued since the Great Recession with this sort of drumbeat that, people don't have to be homeowners. The value of home ownership has been a persistent, growing asset for a long time in America. It's had its ups, it's had its downs. I find it a little intriguing that sort of the illicit manipulation of the mortgage market has become suddenly a reason why people are encouraged not to buy homes anymore. And it distresses me a little bit because there are opportunity costs to owning a home. But we also see on the other side that if you don't own a home, people are unlikely to save those assets as aggressively as they would if it was simply in the value of their home. So I think that we are wrong to lose sight of the objective of consistently attempting to increase the rate of home ownership, especially among some of the groups that we saw in a couple of the presentations with much lower home ownership rates than in other places. It's not for everyone. We may not always be in the midst of a period of high home inflation, and there are other reasons for the society that that's not so good all the time. But nonetheless, I think we should still be pursuing that as a public policy goal. Yes, and then, sir, and then, let's see, where's the mic? This gentleman here, and then I think we might switch to the other side for a little while as well. I'm a lefty, so I'm looking at that side all the time.
Hi, Mark. A. Richard Miller, Miller Microcomputer Services. In Metro West, I volunteer for open source software and for environmental activism. I'm looking at what seems to me to be a bit of a gap. I appreciate everything I heard. I know it's true. But I've also been a little while in Europe. France, I know some from Germany. And the people I talk to there wonder why we place so much emphasis on assets and homes. And they think that they're already guaranteed equivalence to those assets and that home. They don't have to work to get a lot of but we have to work and have a good job to afford. And they do work. They work for other things. But what we call assets are what they call liabilities. We don't have adequate government support for the minimum requirements, and therefore we have to store up extra on our own. I wonder to what degree a different look at the same numbers would occur with a European analysis of it. Any comments?
That's a great. So just very quickly, and my own thoughts.
She's going to start off by saying, again, I'm not speaking for Janet Yellen, I'm sure, but
yes. Maybe. She's great. Okay, maybe I shouldn't even say that, but she is. So I think you alluded to something in that, in the way that may be different, that it's so important here for families to have their own, because it doesn't exist, otherwise it's not provided. Like universal health that you could find in most European countries, free education, even at a college level, like France, it's the only example that I know a little bit better. So you don't need to worry about student debt, even childcare support. So a lot of those things where maybe you don't need that big of an asset elsewhere, you do have to have it here. So I think I think it is a different system, and that's why it's so important. But I think, Piketty's work on his latest book on wealth inequality showed that inequality in terms of wealth is also, it's widespread around the world. It just so happens that the United States is so big, and then with the complication of the different groups that fare much, much worse than others. So I didn't answer your question. I guess I'm reinforcing your point that it's a different set, but we do need to look at that in the context of the United States, I think.
Thank you, Anna. Others? Jesse?
Just to build off what Anna said, I agree absolutely. I think assets in the United States act as a safety net for folks where benefits and support might be lacking. So we absolutely need to look at how to support our lower wage income earners. And even though we have one of the highest educational attainment rates in the country, still 50% of our workers don't have a college education. So we need to continue to think about jobs for those workers so that they can have income and have a support system for health emergencies or other types of emergencies or another recession.
Thank you, Jesse. I am going to move over to this side if we can. I don't know if I need to ask this young lady to go over to this side or if we have another person with a mic. We have someone with a mic. Yes, sir.
I'm David. I work on affordable housing. I'm a real estate developer. Work for a real estate developer. I'm an urban planner. And I couldn't agree more with what he was saying. And for me, it's great what you guys provide. I think the indicators that you measure are important. But then us as leaders of collecting data and sort of this is what inform policymakers and everything. What are your sort of take in looking at other indicators that are based on health? We base so much research on economic inequality, income, like jobs, money. But then at the end of the day, is that the most important thing, or having secure housing and pushing forward to what maybe really matters to other people than us as researchers and informing the leaders that takes those decisions that influence so many people? What are your leads on maybe looking at other indicators just not based on that?
I will say one thing that might not have come through in the presentation, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the work of the Boston Indicators Project, it was started well back in the late 90s, but meant to look more comprehensively at measures of economic, social, and environmental change. So we actually track indicators and data across 10 sectors, from civic vitality to the arts, health, environment, technology, safety, transportation, and these all very much informed. This focus was just really mostly on economic and human development pipelines, but infused in that is a lot of other indicators that inform our thinking. And I would say too, not to speak for MAPC, but as a regional planning agency that really focuses on things like land use and transit and infrastructure and development and also policy, I think that there's much more in their framework in Metro Future that also is a really important lens for thinking about prosperity in a region and well-being.
Thank you. Let's say that gentleman right over there, yes. No, the one that has the mic, I guess, is how this is working out. So.
Hi, I'm Jake Stern from Boston Public Schools. I had a question about the Federal Reserve data. I thought it really struck me the, Caribbean Black data. It seemed like there was a real bright spot there in terms of relative performance. And I wonder what you attribute that to, if there was any underlying data or other kind of information that led to that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to provide many details. But I think what's interesting is that even the bright spot is not doing great, right? Things are so bad that 50% homeownership rate seems like a great statistic. So keeping that in mind, I think part of it, and what others have studied, is that, again, this idea of it's so important, the legacy is so important, and the what you start with and the assets that you have to start with are important. So we can make many assumptions. I think the the United States has, unfortunately, a history of, for example, discrimination in the housing market with redlining, and which continues to happen, that has its implications over time, and also of segregation in terms of housing markets and prices that, as you see over time, that accumulates, and it could be that more recent immigrants don't have that kind of legacy when they come here. It is a story of more likely to have better education, and Caribbean blacks are more likely to be college graduates, so that influences that. But I think that in itself, it's something that what I was hoping would happen with this type of data, so we can then continue studying the underlying causes of this. So I didn't answer your question. I think I'm pointing to. I'm glad you noticed that. I think there's much more to do. I don't know if others may know better kind of the differences and subtleties.
Please. Yes.
Howard Katz, and I provide works that explain and convince grant writing, advocacy writing, and technical writing for clients, Mr. Communications. I want to ask about metropolitan government, which we don't really have in the Boston area, but other cities in North America, such as Toronto, has strong metropolitan government. If we had much more metropolitan government in Eastern Massachusetts, how would that change the issues that you've been presenting and that we're looking at?
Interesting.
Well, I would say, thinking about at the regional scale, what we are starting to see is as it becomes less and less kind of affordable to live in the more inner core communities, we see a lot of households moving out to other pockets within the region. And it's pretty dispersed, so it's really important that we continue to watch that movement and ensure that there are supports and systems in place throughout the region, not just in the cities where they kind of been built up as that changes. I don't know if Mark or anyone else wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would add only, obviously, if we had metropolitan government in Boston, one difference would be that I would be the mayor, so that, might have some influence, I don't know. But what I have seen in regard to metropolitan systems in Canada, in a few parts of the United States, and in other places, is that it does seem to make a distribution difference in terms of what we would consider to be local assets, distribution of taxes, placement of taxes, and a variety of other things, particularly in regard to school expenditures. It doesn't actually seem to make as big a difference as you might expect in terms of personal assets and income. And I think that that's sort of a difference there. You can get some benefits out of metropolitanization, no doubt about that. And I often wish, of course, sort of part of my job, to wish and to push for more regional consensus and more regional action. But it is not a solution to some of the deep inequalities that we see in the presentations that were before us this morning. Other questions and comments? I think we'll ask this gentleman right down here, if we could.
Thank you. My name's George Fisher. I'm a local investment manager, so sort of unaffiliated in that sense. I'd like to ask a question with respect to the bathtub analogy, because it seems to me that if the water coming in is less than the water going out, even affordable housing isn't affordable. And I wonder if there are policy measures that can address that somewhat more basic issue. Because, as I say, if you can't afford it, it isn't affordable.
And I think that picture of less water coming in than less going out, it's negative equity, and some families do owe more than what they own, and that complicates matters further. And it's also, I think, it also, I think, forces us to think a little bit again beyond the wage that a family may have or the social benefits that a family may have, but what is linked to that job. Like if it's not only the wage, but it is the opportunities to, again, say for retirement, opportunities to have paid medical leave, access to childcare, so things that go beyond that wage. Because even if you have a job, if you have to leave because you have a child sick at home and you have to either quit or you don't have that income coming in, then you get in a situation where you definitely don't have water left, you have negative equity. So I think getting a comprehensive look at what families are really getting, not only in wages but in benefits, is very important. The affordable housing piece, I don't know if you others want to respond.
Well, I guess just more generally, though, I think in terms of looking at some of the data and the policies and disaggregating different types of income and earnings that households have is the whole issue of the cliff effect and how, sometimes some income that households are getting are actually public transfers, and that can be a huge share of household income, and therefore might actually create different pathways or different barriers in terms of affordability issues of childcare, housing, et cetera.
Yeah, and just the quick thought also in terms of that bathtub, in reality is a water that closes and opens for lower income families, right? It's very unstable. The work that is done with the U.S. Financial Diaries that is looking at a set of things, 200 families, looking at their daily transactions, and what they look at, find the most important thing is that the idea of instability, or getting to stability, because families are very lower income families are very sophisticated actually in the way they manage their finances, because they have to deal with those ups and downs. So you have that water that comes and goes, and so that's, I think, also important for us to think about. Again, it's not just a matter of average income in the year, but how do we deal with those ups and downs during the year or during a month?
Thank you. Emily, I think, has a mic back there. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ivan Lozano, and I'm with the Gaston Institute for Latino and Community Development. My question is particularly for Anna, but the MAPC can also take a hand. It's with the net worth of Latinos, mainly the Dominican and the Puerto Rican. What do you think is like the main causation of them not having net worth? In the field, I work in like signing people for health and care insurance, and I see that there's a lot of newcomers, a lot of international migration, and many don't have like full-time jobs, so unemployment can be a causation of that. And then other aspects other causation that you mentioned is that a lot of like mothers or families, they transfer a lot of funds outward internationally and also for college education, and that minimizes the amount of net worth that they can increase within years.
Yeah, so part of where you see the zeros or the eights at the median is, so we're talking about formal savings. So for example, starting with the basis of whether a family has a savings or checkings account. And as we saw, I think half of Dominicans don't have. So right there, your median is zero, right? It doesn't mean that these families don't have some kinds of savings in their homes that are not formal savings. By that I mean they may have it under the mattress, or so that kind of explains why you get to that picture. Then a home ownership rate of less than 20%, again, you get that zero there very quickly, right? If you don't have a home, you don't have a home equity. So that kind of gets into the home ownership piece that my colleagues here are experts on. But the other reality is what you were talking about in terms of medical debt. And we saw 20% of Dominicans say they have medical debt. Again, even though we have a system now that hopefully is tackling those issues. And it is maybe a story of immigration and where people are and what they know and what types of benefits they get access to, and something that I think we need to think more and more about, given the growth that that specific group, for example, is having in the region. So those problems will only increase if we don't deal with them. Another, I think, interesting fact of this different groups is, for example, about a third of Dominicans reported sending remittances home. So again, that's something in terms of policy that we should take into account when these groups become bigger and bigger. Same thing with Caribbean blacks. I think it was also close to a third that sent remittances. So I'm providing just a few examples of just to illustrate how I think how different I think the specific group of Dominicans are compared to others, and all those challenges that I think we need to face, and try to address and support.
We have about 5 more minutes, and I'd like to try and generate a few questions from the back half of the room, if there are folks there who have questions. Very good, yes.
Thanks. I'm Jennifer Morris. I'm from Lincoln, Massachusetts, volunteer government, and I'm going to ignore this. Sorry.
Great timing.
Yeah, really. This may be for the Boston Fed. I'm thinking about wondering if anyone has done any work looking at the impact of student debt on wealth accumulation, because we see it as a benefit in terms of income, but whether that holds down the opportunities for home ownership or increases it. I just wonder if any projections have been done and how it would impact policy around student debt and loan forgiveness.
Yes, student debt is a hot topic, and actually I can send you a paper by an economist, I think it was David Cooper, that wrote exactly, not on wealth, but on homeownership, which is a big part of wealth, of net worth. So he actually did, I think he used the PSID, which is a panel study that follows families for years, and looked at what are the effects on having student loan debt on homeownership. And there are some statistical significance there. So I will send you the link to the paper that you can look more into detail. So there's some on that specific aspect of it. But definitely I've heard interest from the Joint Center at Harvard interested in this issue about student loans and then mortgages and others. So I'm sure there will be more, but I can send you that paper. That's a great read.
Make sure to give Anna your card so she can get that to you, okay? All right. Other questions? Yes, miss, please, right here, behind the post. Emily, if you could. There we go.
Hi, Marina Wall, affiliated with Miller Microcomputer. I'm wondering 2 questions. Is there any sort of directory of the research that's being done that could help coordinate efforts and interests by researchers and data scientists? And secondly, is there any effort to make the data that's been gathered, the research that's been done, more distributable to a broad group of people? I'm thinking with the upcoming election cycle that this information could be very interesting to people, and wondering what is in place right now to share it.
Yeah, so I can say for the regional prosperity indicators, all of our data is up on regionalindicators.org. All of the indicators and many more than I was able to talk about today. All of those kind of fun interactive visualizations are available through that website. You can also download the data behind all the visualizations, and we encourage you to do so. We also have the Metro Boston Data Common, which Holly is going to be talking about this afternoon, which is another great resource for data.
Yeah, and that also helps to power the Boston Indicators Project. That's always been a really at the core of the mission of the work that we've done with MAPC over the last 15 years, which is not just to put the data out there, but to make it accessible to folks. And there are, I think, as you'll see in some of our afternoon plenary sessions on open data, civic technologies, and how governments are approaching data, these efforts to make data publicly available and accessible to a broad set of stakeholders is really growing in new ways. And so I think, yes, lots of places. Yes, and exactly. Holly St. Clair just mentioned there's some academic networks, the Boston Area Research Initiative, which is housed at Radcliffe, but also pulls from here at Northeastern. Dan O'Brien, who's on the panel later today, is a professor here and the research director of BARI, as well as the Urban Network, which is really focused on doing community-based participatory research, are doing quite a bit of work in advancing open data among some of these more advanced academic and rigorous academic research studies that are creating and using new data to kind of share, I think, knowledge and connective tissue among academics, but also to help relate it to communities and folks like us who do more indicators, simpler data work.
Thank you. We're going to have one more question before we move on to the next part of the program, and I think Amy has someone back there. Is that right?
Yes, hi. I had a similar question. I just wondered, you know, the rate of poverty remaining unchanged for 25 years is very concerning, and I'm sure it's been a lot longer. But are there other cities who are collecting data like this? Are there other cities who are using it in a really effective way that has actually moved the needle? And what can we learn from them that we can, you know, use in Boston?
Actually, I'm proud to say that the Boston Indicators Project and MAPC as partners in this work are also members of something called the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is run and coordinated out of the Urban Institute and started back in the mid-90s as, I think, 6 cities, and now has grown to just about 40 regions across the country that do this kind of work. Really, how do you use data to affect positive community change? And we meet in a different city every 6 to 9 months together to talk in person, share what we've been working on, but also have a lot of robust online portals and listservs, and I hope some of them, I believe, are watching right now to see what we're doing here. And cities I think are really, especially as the data revolution happens, talking more and more and sharing more about how we can learn from each other's work, but there's quite a bit there.
Does the partnership have a website?
Yes.
That's publicly available?
Yes, I believe it is neighborhoodindicators.org. We can tweet that out. We'll make it available via Twitter with the hashtag Day2Day and also on the Tumblr site.
Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, and thanks to our panel. I'd like to give them one final round of applause, please. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Holly St. Clair, who's my colleague at MAPC and the director of our Data Services Department. Holly is really the moving force behind Day2Day on an annual basis. She has plenty of help and partners, both inside and outside the agency, but I always think of it as her event. And she is going to help direct us to the rest of the day. Holly.
All right. Wow, it's great to see all your faces, and I'm just curious to see how many of you have been to a Day2Day before. So I'm going to go through a series of questions. I know it's a little hokey, but I get really excited about it. How many, this is your first time at a Day2Day? Raise your hand. Wow, welcome, welcome. How many have been to 2 Day2Days? Okay, excellent. 3 Day2Days? 4 Day2Days? Charlie, 5 Day2Days? Remind me your name? Mike Manning. I think you get the prize, Mike. Thank you very much. That's great. So this is something we hope to keep doing as we move forward, and I encourage you to come back every year. I think one of the things that is really important and has changed over the past years is that we're moving from open data, where we're really focusing on just getting the data out there, pulling it out of the databases and the basements of administrative offices, putting them into the hands of people so they can work with it. We're moving from open data to effective data, right? That's what we heard a lot about today. And what I mean by effective data is just putting a data set out there doesn't really change our neighborhoods or improve our quality of life. But when we, as activists in our communities or policymakers, use that data, sometimes and hopefully in collaboration with activists, we can really make change together, and that's effective data. And part of effective data, the real difference between open data and effective data, is when you have more people looking at the same data set, and more people can use that data. And it's getting harder as technology changes over time, as well as the skill sets get more and more complicated. So part of Day2Day here is to build capacity in us to learn how to use data better, learn about new tools that might be open source or free, and to learn how to use them to tell a better data story about our community or the particular issue we're interested in. So thank you for joining us for that. And I just want to, one of the pieces of wisdom that I really heard that came out of today's discussions this morning was that the truth lies between looking at the data and living the data. And I just want to really underline that, because data is a great starting point for the conversations we have to have about our community, but we need to have community partners, activists, residents at the table with us, pointing at the data too and saying that makes sense, that doesn't, and then we have to debate what's the difference, where's the truth in between, and then move forward together. That creates better understanding, and that's what this day is about. So I encourage you to ask questions, challenge each other, and really learn. Don't just assume you should know something because someone said it. Ask questions, we're here to learn. So the rest of the day we have a set of interactive workshops this morning, And they are distributed, most of the non-computer workshops are upstairs and the second and third floor. There's a sheet in your electronic packet, or I guess a sheet in your PDF of the electronic packet, that has the different room numbers. If you're unsure about those room numbers, you can go down to the registration desk or ask one of us. We'll have the sheet with us as well. If you're going to a computer lab, those tend to be out of this building. So computer lab, there will be guides down in registration that's on the ground floor. They'll be holding up signs, and they can help you walk to the building you need to get to. There's also a campus map included in your packet. And again, if you have questions, registration is the right place to go, or grab one of us who are on staff. And then after that, after the session, we have lunch. And there's the mezzanine level that I don't know if people saw across from the construction. And by the way, thank you for your patience about the construction. This is not ideal, but we made it work because we love partnering with Northeastern. This is such a great space with the computer labs and the classrooms so available to us. But we are having lunch where there was breakfast, and there's also the poster sessions. There'll also be a few experts around technology and social media and other experts that will be there to answer questions. And honestly, we're all experts in our own right, so just make sure you talk to people and network. And we'll have lunch. We have about 250 lunches ordered. That might cover most of the people in the room, but it might not. So I want to offer you other options too. There's food court in the first floor or the ground floor. There's also Abon Pan and burrito shops and other things on the Huntington Ave. After lunch, that's done at 1:30, you come back here for a plenary session on data, innovation, and civic technology. And we'll be premiering sort of the next generation of the Data Common, which we've made some improvements to since the last time we were all here. As well as we'll be having a great panel that will be talking about some of the new collaboration that's happening between different organizations in Boston around civic technology. It's sort of the civic tech ecosystem and what that is. And more in particular, what is your role in that ecosystem? And then we'll have our final set of workshops from 3:30 to 5. So that's the logistics for the day. If you have any questions, I'll be by the door and you can talk to me, or you can check with registration. Thank you very much.